Well, I am delighted to introduce you to Josh Glessing for the latest iteration of the K&L Gates Client Conversation podcast. This is I think you'll find a fascinating story of somebody who went from a structured finance background to getting directly into the sports space. And so we want to explore that path. Josh joined the Haslam Sports Group in 2019 as the Vice President of Strategy. That is the entity that owns the Cleveland Browns, the Columbus Crew, and has a piece of an esports franchise as well. We'll get into that. I think that's called Misfit Gaming. Is that right, Josh?
That is.
Josh has an interesting path. He started at the PFM Group, advising state and local governments on large-scale capital projects, and then was recruited into Goldman Sachs and was the vice president in the global sports finance and advisory practice there, and then moved to the Midwest to join Haslam, where he lives in Columbus. So thank you for taking the time to do this, Josh. I think people are going to really enjoy it.
Well, I hope they do, but thank you for having me, and excited to talk a little bit.
Yeah. So tell me, I know you grew up in Wisconsin, went to Indiana. Talk a little bit about your path and you know how you got interested in finance and working on big projects like that, and then how that morphed into your role with Haslam.
Most of my former colleagues at Goldman Sachs, a lot of them knew exactly what they knew they were going to be at Goldman Sachs. They knew exactly what they were going to do after Goldman Sachs. You know, for me, it was a little bit less defined. I went to Indiana because I wanted to get out of the state of Wisconsin, but I didn't want to get too far outside of my comfort zone. So I went to IU originally with the intention to go to law school. So I have undergraduate degrees in sociology through the School of Arts and Sciences and public affairs. And then my junior year, and for me, I think when I wanted to go to law school is because I knew exactly what I had to do to be a lawyer. And it was just easier for me as an 18-year-old to say, I would like to do this because it was really, really, really well defined. I didn't have a tremendous amount of guidance in my life growing up as to, what career paths existed in the world. But when I got a better understanding, I said, I don't think that really fits my skill set. I don't think I'd be good at that. I don't think I want to do that. So I went to my guidance counselor and said, hey, I don't want to do this law school thing after undergrad, but I don't know exactly what I want to do. But it strikes me that the smartest and easiest path is to just go to the business school, get a degree in finance, and then that opens up a lot of avenues for me. So my counselor said, you can do that. It's just going to cost you 1 to 2 extra years in school. And that wasn't really on the table for me. So we went back and forth, and it just so happened that Indiana University has a program in public finance. And at that point, all I really, really cared about was putting the word finance on my resume.
Right.
And if the word public was before it, great, fine, whatever. I just want to put the word finance on my resume. So I ended up that summer getting an internship in capital markets at what then was called Countrywide Financial. At the end of summer, it was Bank of America. And I really, really enjoyed that. I also really enjoyed being 21, living in Los Angeles for a summer. And then went back to school, and it was, sort of dark days for people who wanted to get jobs in general, let alone finance. But I had a job offer, so I was, on top of the world when all my friends were trying to get jobs in finance that didn't exist. Unfortunately, all of the first-year analysts that were going to go to that program, their offers were reneged on, which was a devastating blow for me. And I was really 4 or 5 months behind my peers in recruiting for full-time opportunities. The reality is that wouldn't have necessarily mattered that much because no one was getting a job. I would have just been working longer to not have a job. So I then decided to focus on public finance because that's what my resume said. And even though I had gotten at that point was well on my way to a degree in public finance, I still didn't really know what it meant. I was really good at getting good grades on tests surrounding public finance, but I didn't totally know what it meant. And I had one interview with a company called PFM Group that's headquartered in Philadelphia, but it was on their desk in Charlotte. And I'd come to find out later that they just assumed I loved public finance because I had a degree with a focus on public finance. And by the way, Indiana University is one of 3 schools in the country that has a program with a focus on public finance. So they just assumed this kid from Wisconsin, and maybe it's because I told them, I don't remember. This kid from Wisconsin went to Indiana because he wanted a degree in public finance, because he loves public finance so much. And at that point, you use anything you can to your advantage when it's just so difficult to get a job in any part of finance. So I ended up getting a job at PFM in Charlotte. Was there for a couple of years on the desk, and then they moved me to Los Angeles where I was doing advisory work. And by chance, worked on a number of sports projects representing states and local governments on their contribution to private stadium projects. And I spoke fluent municipal finance at this point. Sat on the other side of Goldman Sachs on a couple of sports projects, and ultimately got a call from Greg Carey, who's the head of the sports practice at Goldman. Said, hey, do you want to sit on the other side of the table? Do you want to represent teams and owners in projects that have a public finance component? So I did that. I moved from Los Angeles to New York, and did a lot of sports for a little over 6 years, representing teams all over the world on all sorts of matters, from advisory work to financing work. And we were towards the end. I mean, 6 years in investment banking at Goldman, sort of like a year in human life is 7 years of dog life. That's a solid 50 plus years. My wife and I, had our first kid at that point. We were ready to think what was next. But I loved my job and what I was doing, but represented the Haslam family in their purchase of the Columbus Crew. Made a passive comment one day that to the COO of then the Cleveland Browns, now what's called Haslam Sports Group, that at some point we'd probably move back to the Midwest. And got a call the next day. You're interested in moving to the Midwest. So we came here to Columbus in the summer of 2019, where, as you introduced, and the head of strategy for what's called Haslam Sports Group is the parent company of the Browns and the Crew. And then I oversee our venture initiatives and our real estate initiatives. And it's been fantastic. Columbus has been fantastic. I'm very, very grateful that I get to work for fantastic people in Jimmy and Dee Haslam and JW and Whitney Johnson. Incredibly fortunate that we also get to do really, really interesting things. I mean, you mentioned Misfits Gaming, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the other stuff we're doing, but they share my thesis on the opportunity that exists around sports entertainment, health, wellness, and technology. So we get to do some really, really, really cool stuff. Being a Browns fan is hard business. Been a diehard Browns fan for 2.5 years. It's not as easy as the first 30 plus years of my life where I was a Packer fan. But it's been fantastic, and certainly not a traditional route to my current seat. Admittedly, I don't think there's a traditional route to my current seat because there are a lot of sports teams that have the word strategy, and they all mean very, very different things.
Yeah, no, it is. My title has strategy in it too, or it's Global Strategic Growth Partner, and I always have to explain what it means. What's the relevance? I want to pick up on a couple of threads. There's so many topics I want to cover, but the first thread is, and I think some of our listeners are probably earlier on in their careers, and we've had another event, maybe for some with just as impactful consequences with COVID, and a little bit of how you had a conversation with yourself when you thought you were going to go down one path with Bank of America, and you end up having to start all over again. Talk a little bit about what you did, what you leaned on, how you thought about that so that you could move forward in a productive way.
When I found out that my job offer was reneged, I remember distinctly. I was sitting in the library in Bloomington working on a group project. And at that point in time, when you needed to save a file, you would email it to yourself. And I remember sitting at my computer, and also it wasn't tied into my phone. That wasn't a thing quite yet. So when I opened my email, it was the first time I've seen it. Now I see it on my phone long before I ever see it on my computer. I opened up my email to set myself a file, and I've got 3 partners on a group project that are sitting with me. And at the top of it is an email from the HR person that was overseeing all things with the summer program and the endless program. And for whatever reason, I clicked on it before sending myself the email. Maybe it's because I was just so happy and confident that I was the only person that had a job. And just a few sentences, it basically said, unfortunately, you don't have a role for next summer. And I just remember, and maybe they didn't even see it. I remember everyone staring at me and staring at that email in my head, and just this crushing blow. What am I going to do? And, from there, I didn't really have a lot of time to think about what I was going to do. I didn't have a safety net to sort of travel. I've got friends that traveled for a year and said, let me just wait for this to be over. I didn't have that. So I just went laser focused. I didn't rely on just the university resources. I was throwing my resume into the black box that is the internet, and just trying to touch as many places and people as I could. And, fortunately, in hindsight, I could argue I developed a strategy at the time. I was just doing whatever I could to find a job, just like everybody else. And I just so happened to have this really, really niche piece. I was the only one looking for public finance jobs directly, because it struck me as the easiest path to a job. There was no other strategy behind it. I mean, at the end of the day, it was a numbers game. And then I did hone in on what seems to be the path of least resistance, and that was public finance. And that world, I showed up day one, still not really know what it is. I ended up loving working in public finance, but that was a huge gut check for me. That moment in time, realizing I didn't actually have a job, and it was really stressful. And at that time, you think, well, this is it. It's all over. I'm going to, be the general manager of a shoe store in the mall. And I worked hard, and it fortunately worked out.
Yeah, I'd say so.
I spent all of probably the entirety of that night. I don't know what day of the week it was, but there's a high likelihood that I went to the bar. But I felt sorry for myself for a night, and then I got after it.
Yeah, no, it's a great lesson. And the other thread I wanted to pick up on is something I've read and heard you say, is kind of how you treat relationships with people. You don't burn bridges. You don't know where those relationships will end or begin, or how they're going to evolve. So talk a bit about your philosophy. You've got this unique path where you can really trace your career to the cultivation of those relationships. So talk about a little bit, be modest if you would, about what are some of those things you do to keep relationships alive?
I mean, it starts with, you just treat people like people. Everything's just so much easier when you just respect people, and you do. I don't even want to say do well by people. It doesn't have to be intentional. Just treat people with care and respect, and every now and again, a relationship will develop and will blossom. When I left PFM and went to Goldman, my mentor, who was like a father figure to me, is a guy named Mike Mace. He's the head of public power and energy at PFM Group, but before that, he was at Goldman Sachs. And I was very, very close to him, and I was open with him, on all things job, and he was my boss. So I went to interview at Goldman with people who I knew, right? So I developed those relationships sitting across the table from people who, and quite frankly, negotiating against other people. And I'll never forget the day I interviewed, I looked up and there was another person from my team, a peer of mine, quite frankly, who was smarter and more talented than I still is today. And he was interviewing for the same job that I was ultimately interviewing for. I remember the last conversation I had, it was not a part of my formal super day interview. It was just hey, go sit with this woman who I'd met before, a woman named Jill Teport, who was the head of power and energy at Goldman Sachs. And it was somewhat a casual conversation. And she said, "Hey, what would Mike Mace say if he found out you were here right now?" And I said, "Two people know that I'm here in New York City right now interviewing. One is Mike Mace, and the other is my mother." So after that, my colleague who also interviewed calls me from the airport and says to me, "Hey, they asked me what Mike Mace would say if I found out." And I said, or they said, they asked if they would be okay, if he would be okay if Mike Mace reached out. And he said no. So the two differences are my more talented colleague says you can't reach out to my current boss. And me, less talented, says he knows I'm here. And I learned a lot from that from Mike's perspective. Like, he cared about me.
Yeah.
He wanted what was best for me. And if I believed that going to Goldman was best for me, he was going to support me. And we were able to have, open, honest conversations about my career at a time when I was indirectly working for him.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just so much value to that. And that also goes to show you have to be thoughtful of, about who you work for as much as where you work. Because if I didn't have that relationship with him and I answered the question the exact same way as my colleague, they may say, we can't burn a bridge with Mike Mace. We can't hire this person.
Yeah, and it goes to, we met on for the listeners' benefit, we met on a general counsel roundtable that we've done a number of. And I remember one of the topics that day was on vulnerability and how to lead through the pandemic. And it strikes me that one of the takeaways is that when you work with somebody, even if they're senior to you, trusting them to give them all the information so they can actually be your true ally is such an important part of the mentorship process.
I'll add to it a little bit because it's probably relevant. So then fast forward, from that point, 6+ years later, I'm representing the Haslam family as part of their purchase of the crew and building a new stadium. And I'm their advisor. I work for them. I'm client services. And I did that for about 6 months before ultimately a passive comment resulted in would you actually come work for us? And when you think about it in hindsight, it was so much easier for me to go through that process because I had effectively been interviewing with them for 6 months. Like, I had been taking care of them as my client and putting their interests at the forefront and representing them. And you can only learn so much in a 2-hour interview, but 6 months of, in the trenches together, you learn a lot about somebody. And it works both ways. I learned a lot about them just as much as they learned a lot about me. So that is a clear. And then I ultimately accepted a job that didn't exist, right? They said, there's this person who we think could be a good fit. He's not going to be in corporate partnerships. He's not going to be our general counsel. We don't have a natural position for this person, but we like him. We know him. Let's make it up. And that's how I get here. So, that transition is also directly driven by relationships, because I tell my boss regularly, there are people more capable than me to do my job. That's just the reality of it. There are people more capable of you to do your job. I mean, the reality is I am not number one ultimate to do the job that I currently do. But when you develop relationships and you build relationships, it just makes it so much easier to make those big transitions in life.
It is so true. I occasionally will speak and I'll use a clip from an Under Armour commercial with Michael Phelps. And it's, after he's won all his gold medals and, he's decided to get back into it and go back to the Olympics. And he's, it's really dramatic. I don't know if you've seen it, but he's swimming in a dirty pool at, when it's dark outside, and he's getting suction cups on his back, and, he's in a ton of pain, and he, whatever. And at the end, it says it's what you do in the dark that matters. And it seems like, kind of a consistent theme of yours, that it doesn't matter whether the spotlight is on you while you're working. You have to act as if it is. And it's a great lesson. So I want to shift gears to Goldman because, and there've been books written about this, but I'm so curious about these great institutions. And you were there for, as you say, 50 years and dog years. But Goldman's iconic, McKinsey's iconic. These great institutions. What is, from your vantage point, from what you saw, what's the Goldman secret sauce that you think you take away with you and will carry through your career, besides just working your tail off?
What pushed me the most, and what I think I was ultimately better for on the other side, and I would imagine that a high percentage of people that worked there feel the same way. I was surrounded by people that were smarter than me, and I was just trying to keep up, and everyone is doing that. And it is pushing you to the brink. And at the same time, I knew that if I took my foot off the gas, there was a line of people out the door that wanted my job. So on some level, it may be some insecurity that pushed me. I truly, truly don't think there's a place that I could have been for 6 years where I learned as much as I did and come out better on the other end. Now, it was hard. There were dark days, but when I look back on it, it truly is with fond memories, because I think it helped me professionally advance myself and my ability to, I don't have the same, and I hope it's not arrogance, but there I felt I had imposter syndrome. Mm-hmm. I think it pushed me so far that I've moved away from that a little bit. I still have some, but I think there's just so many smart people all working hard, all working together. It is an institution, and it did everything right. Even all of the little things, it's one of those things, all of the little things, the teeniest tiny things, they did right. And clients used to say when they came to the front desk and someone, welcomed them by name and had their name tag and showed them where to go, and there was just respect from the person at the front door to Lloyd Blankfein or David Solomon. There was respect that clients came first, and it really, really it's a hospitality business as much as it is a financial services business. And we'd hear that not all the banks did that. Not all the banks did the really, really, really little stuff right. Goldman does everything, the little stuff and the big stuff right.
Yeah, I remember hearing a presentation from somebody from McKinsey, and they basically talk about the experience journey and how you really have to curate that journey with the client so that every piece of that journey is exactly the way it needs to be. That's fascinating to hear from an inside perspective. Okay, so shifting a bit to the public,
and it certainly doesn't hurt that the network that comes out of Goldman is just second to none. Second. No.
Lot of impressive alums, yeah. And the fact that that the institution's bigger than you are. There's a level of humility that has to come with that you are a piece of something bigger than you that has to challenge you and make you better.
I heard Lloyd Blankfein, he spoke once, and I really gravitated to some of his comments. He said that every single day as he's walking up to 200 West Street and he looks up at Goldman Sachs, he thinks to himself, is today the day that everyone finds out I don't know what I'm doing? And then he went on to say, and the day that you don't walk up to that building in awe, that today might be the day that everyone figures out that you don't know what you're doing, you should do something else. If you've got it so dialed in that it's no longer challenging you or pushing you to be better every single day, you should do something else.
That's gold.
Yeah.
That's gold. That's really good. Thank you. Okay, shifting to public finance. So you've been on all sides of this. And I'm a Dallas guy. I remember when the Cowboys went to the public and, here's this billionaire saying, we need taxpayer money. The Rangers have done it. Everybody has had, whether it's a tax abatement or actual dollars given by the citizens, the taxpayers, organizations have to, in the sports world, typically ask for money from the public. Talk a little bit about the psychology of that game, the politics of it, how you've played a role in those conversations, And what are some of the things, what were some of the real obstacles that you have to overcome to get the public financing in place to do the things that Haslam has done and some of the other clients you've represented have done?
Yeah, we can use the Cowboys as a really good example. The Dallas Cowboys that play football in the city of Arlington, which is a different tax district than Dallas. It is. I think there's a lot that is said about sports team owners getting public dollars for their private projects and they're billionaires. What I think is the reality is local governments are also competing for these teams in their tax districts. If you look at the city of Arlington and what has happened around Cowboy Stadium, the Texas Rangers Stadium, which is also in the city of Arlington, the economic development and impact that those dollars have had in that community far outweighs the $500 million that the city of Arlington gave the Dallas Cowboys. It outweighs it on an annual basis. So there's value in it, just like there's value for Frisco or there's value for the city of Dallas. And some places there's more competition, right? But those cities are competing for that team in the same exact way that cities were competing for Amazon and HQ2. Cities are competing for professional sports teams because of the economic impact that it has. And I'll use what we're doing here in Columbus as an example. It's part of a much bigger story, the Save the Crew story, and the former owner attempting to relocate the crew to Austin prior to the Haslams stepping in, where we have built a $315 million stadium in one of the fastest growing cities in America was on a 35-acre piece of undeveloped land that no one could really figure out how to develop because you couldn't do it organically. You needed one major thing to drive the impact. So what you now have on this piece of land that no one could figure out for decades how to develop, and it was sitting there with abandoned buildings, you now have the nicest stadium in Major League Soccer, a spectacular event center that has hosted 2 U.S. men's national team matches in the last 4 months, both of which more than 60% of the people in the building came from outside of Central Ohio, right? That is economic impact 101. Get people who are not in the tax district to come here, stay at hotels, go to dinner, bring dollars into the economy, right? That's 101. But for the new stadium, that doesn't happen. And then in the coming months, we'll break ground on a commercial building with retail and office. We'll break ground on the first 440 residential units of housing that includes 20% affordable housing units on a piece of land that no one could figure out for decades how to develop. You've now got one of the nicest neighborhoods in all of the city of Columbus. So the city knew that, the county knew that, the state knew that. There's value to this sports team being here. A lot of people always want to get caught up in the story about the Columbus Crew and Lower.com Field, our new stadium. The way that we talk about it, sports is the catalyst to much bigger economic development and impact story. But for sports, it doesn't exist. But we have to correct people. It's not a sports story. When you come to the stadium, it's not a sports story. It's so much bigger than that. And it has a real, direct, meaningful impact. The ones that people hear about are teams threatening to go to Vegas or teams threatening to go to Seattle. The Oakland Raiders needed a new stadium. These things become very cost prohibitive. The city of Las Vegas and the county, they said, we see value in this. They raised their hands, said, we see value in this. This is how much value we see in you, the Raiders, playing here. And then you're just making a business decision. But the city's making a business decision too. The county is making a business decision too, that there is a return on that investment. And I'm hard pressed, I don't know with any degree of certainty, I'm hard pressed to believe that the investment in helping the Raiders build a new stadium in Las Vegas isn't going to pay dividends in terms of economic impact over and over again. It's a business decision on 2 different sides. It's not just a business decision of the owners.
No, you see it pretty much everywhere you go. And the real estate opportunities, especially in the last decade or so, have become really profound. No, you sold me. But I've been a sports fan, so I've always wanted, we had a mayor in Dallas, Laura Miller, who just didn't understand why the Cowboys ought to be in Dallas. And one of my law partners at the firm I started my career with, that merged into K&L Gates, Hughes and Luce, was a guy named Daryl Jordan, and he wanted to dome the Cotton Bowl and completely revitalize South Dallas and have the Cowboys go there. And the mayor just didn't, the city council just didn't get it at all. And we look back on that as a real missed opportunity. That area is still, relatively undeveloped, certainly what it could have been. That's fascinating. So the Haslams, are really impressive people from what I've read about them. He comes, as I understand it, from the Flying J. That's where he built his wealth. I know Dee is enormously involved in diversity initiatives and giving back to the community. What are some things, you've seen them on working with them, but not under them, and now you've been with them for a few years. What are some things that you kind of pick up on that are the excellence that come out of a Haslam Sports Group?
Yeah. Well, first, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that, Dee is as involved as she is in certain aspects publicly of our business days, involved in all aspects of business, but she is wildly successful personally and professionally herself prior to the Browns and the Crew. So she was the CEO of River Media, a massive production company, has done incredible things on the media front. And, the value of that as it relates to operating sports teams can never be understated, because it's fun to call the Browns and the Crew sports teams. The reality is these are media companies. Sports is the content. Football is the content. But the NFL is a media company. The NFL's take from media and content drastically outweighs its take from selling tickets and selling hot dogs. And it's that way at every single market in the league. So when you have someone with a vast experience in media and in production, that translates meaningfully to the modern business of sports. But they complement each other really, really well, and I'm just so incredibly impressed by both Jimmy and Dee. Jimmy's an operator's operator, right? He understands top line and bottom line cash flows. He understands business, and his ability, I just find it so impressive to manage people and meetings. And someone was actually presenting to Jimmy and Dee and JW earlier this week, and stopped in my office. Hey, I'm presenting. Just wanted to what can I do to prepare? And I said, assume that Jimmy's going to ask a lot of questions, and every time he asks one question, it's to get to the next question. It's perpetually trying to get to the center of it, to go through the layers of the onion. And he's going to dig into everything. And it's just so impressive the way he does it. Watch mind work. And you've got Dee, who is, equally understands the operating businesses, but is a little more creative, and is a little bit more community fan, people focused, and leveraging her creativity to say, okay, what do our fans actually want? What does our community actually want? And truly, truly understanding what that is. And that's how you create value, right? You create value by knowing which your consumers and customers want and how they want it. It was Dee's brainchild, building the Browns, which was sort of a localized Hard Knocks. We did it before anybody. It was groundbreaking. It was because she understood content and media and the value of that. Now everyone does it. Everyone tells a story about their season, what's going on behind closed doors. The Browns did that before anybody, and they did it better. They still do it better than anybody.
Yeah.
And that's driven by that level of, well, what do our fans and our consumers and our customers actually want? not necessarily how do we run this better. So those two just fit so well together, and they both have small parts of both of those. And I just continue to be just wildly impressed by both of them, watching them not only operate the crew or the Browns, but also the other things that we're very active in and involved in and invest in. It's fun.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing the color on that. They do, in doing research for this, I did research on them as well, and it does jump out at you, Dee's appreciation for the psychology of the industry. And it really, I wanted to ask you a question. It's a little selfish to ask you this because my son is at the University of Edinburgh and he's in performance psychology, which really, it's the top master's program allegedly in the world in performance psychology. And it's and the internships are all with the European soccer teams and some of the nascent hockey teams and all that. But talk a little bit. I read more and more about Belichick and Saban and all the different franchises using stoicism. And Ryan Holiday advising them, or other great psychologists talking to the players and explaining to them how important it is, the impression they give to the community. Talk a little bit about how Haslam incorporates performance psychology, and where do you see that going in the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a bigger and bigger part of athletics, and some of it is a reflection of the world we live in today, where everything you do is scrutinized, and I can only imagine how difficult that actually is for some people when they don't have someone that they can talk to and someone that they can engage with to help them understand what they're thinking or what they're going through. You hear stories about things that people say online behind the cloak of the internet, and it's depressing and it's sad, and it's easy to look at that, and for me to look at some stuff and say that shouldn't bother you at all, right? That doesn't matter. It's a lot more difficult when it's you, the person that's being attacked, especially if you're already down and out. I think about receivers who drop a pass. They're already beating themselves up enough. They don't need a bunch of people on Twitter also beating them up. So I think it's really, really difficult. I quite frankly think it's bigger than just sports, though. And that is the reality of the world that we live in. Personally, I don't necessarily think it's healthy, but I also don't think it's going to change. So I think having resources is just incredibly important. And European soccer is actually probably one of, if not the best, at addressing some of those issues. And I think it's going to continue to change. I think it's going to continue to evolve. And there's a universe that exists today that probably didn't exist 3 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. 20 years ago, suck it up, you'll figure it out.
Right. The famous Jimmy Johnson, go to the asthma field, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is. And I can't imagine what it's like to, especially for these athletes who engage in social media. You see them and at first it's like a drug, I imagine, because it's all positive and all, feel like a god, I'm sure. And then something bad happens. And
yeah, health and wellness is a lot bigger than just physical health and wellness in today's sports world, and again, on some level, the world that we live in. It's just amplified for others more than some.
So the organization, through the Browns, just won an award, the John B. Wooten Award, for commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm sure it's described it slightly differently than that, but some of the listeners of this particular podcast are leaders in organizations who are confronting that challenge every day, right? Trying to get better, trying to be more inclusive. And can you talk a little bit about why you think the Browns received that award and some things that you've witnessed that you're particularly proud of?
Yeah, if you look at the Browns organization, the org chart and some of the things that we have done, and a very intentional approach at several layers of the company, we've got an African American GM. The top two lieutenants under that African American GM are both African American. One of them just went on to be the GM of the Minnesota Vikings, Gracie. It has been a huge focus, and it is a focus of all parts of the organization. One of the first teams to put a woman on the coaching staff. So have really, really been focused. And prior to Andrew Berry being GM, we had African American GM, two GMs before him, and had two African American head coaches. It's just been a huge focus of the organization, and we've been fortunate that we've had relationships with people on the sports side to get them. But I'll be honest with you, one of the things that we've seen on the business side is it's really hard. It's really hard to say, I would like to go hire a diverse CMO, a diverse head of corporate partnerships. It's really, really hard, especially today where a lot of people are looking for that exact same thing. So what we did in 2021 is we launched the inaugural Haslam Sports Group Diversity and Opportunity Fellowship, which is focused on giving a really meaningful rotational program. It's a one-year fellowship directly out of undergrad for people in underrepresented communities of sports, women, minorities. So right now we've got 4 people that are going through it for 2021. They spent 6 months at the Browns rotating through departments, and then 6 months at the Crew rotating through departments. So we're trying to find departments and projects and roles and responsibilities that are consistent with what they ultimately want to do. It's easy to say, can't find a really senior head of corporate partnerships because they don't have the right experience, and say, woe is me. If in 15 years we're saying the same thing, then we didn't do anything to try to fix it. We just acknowledged it was a problem. So, and it's really easy to acknowledge something as a problem. It's a lot harder to fix it and address it and take the long game. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to put ourselves in a position so that we can't look up in 15 years and say we have the same problem we had 15 years ago. It's really hard to hire senior level diverse candidates. It's on us. And then the other thing that we've said is we want to make it harder on ourselves to hire these people out of undergrad because everyone's copying us. If we truly, truly believe in this, we don't want to take credit as the only one that's doing this. If we truly, truly believe in this, we're going to give the playbook to every other sports team that cares about this to the same degree that we do, so that everyone is doing it, so that the candidate pool that exists in 5, 10, 15 years as you get more and more senior up the corporate ladder is wide open, is completely and totally wide open. So that's a big, big focus of ours. And then, we're doing other things to help support women athletes. So the WNBA just did a capital raise at the league level. We participated in it. We are huge supporters of women athletics, when and where we can be. And that was an opportunity for us to put our support and quite frankly, Haslam Sports Group capital behind women's professional sports because we think it matters. And by the way, we think it's good business.
Yeah.
We think it's good business. So we're laser focused on continuing to promote diversity, inclusion, growth, create opportunities, step up where we as an organization can. And it starts at the very, very top. It starts with Dee and Jimmy. And fortunately, they have been not just supportive, but leaders in this conversation, leaders in these efforts.
Yeah, it's super impressive. And I love the point of, the pipeline's not going to be an excuse. It just can't be an excuse. You have to cultivate, especially at the base level. My wife and I I was a debater in high school and college, and we founded a program for urban debaters in Dallas to, basically to fund the public school debate. And in Dallas, as you may or may not know, there was a tremendous amount of white flight away from the public schools. So during busing, so that quickly killed debate programs in public schools in Dallas, and that story is told in most of the major metropolitan cities. And so they didn't have money for debate anymore. It wasn't sexy like sports. So, and these kids now are, we just had our annual Mayor's Cup, and one of the judges for the Mayor's Cup was one of our former debaters who's a practicing lawyer at one of the leading firms in town. So, it is. It's the way to do it because we can't fix it overnight. I mean, we can lead overnight, but we can't fix it overnight. So, kudos and incredibly impressive to receive that. So I think this is 27, 28 podcasts. The very first podcast was with a guy I suspect you may know or met or heard of named Ken Hirsch, who owns Hershey Sports and TV Gaming, pretty prominent businessman in Dallas. I just happened to go to high school with him, so he was willing to be one of my early podcast guinea pigs before I knew what I was doing. And he talked a little bit about the esports, where's that headed? But can you talk a little bit about, the Crew and the Browns are obvious to most people, but why the investment in the health and wellness, esports, the real estate, maybe intuitive to people, but talk a little bit about the other stuff Haslam Sports Group does.
Yeah, we believe that sports and sports teams are undervalued. All teams everywhere undervalued. And there's going to continue to be tremendous growth in sports as just an investment. But we also believe in the evolution of that. So 2+ years ago, we said we want to be in and around the business of esports. So we did some diligence and looked at a few opportunities. Ultimately ended up investing in a company called Misfits Gaming out of South Florida, which at the time, and it's part of the reason why we really liked the platform, it had 3 major teams in the 3 biggest leagues in esports in the world: Overwatch League, Call of Duty, and then League of Legends. In this specific instance, our team is in the European League or League of Legends. And what they said is, hey, we've got these things that we can get to being on autopilot, and they're going to grow and they're going to generate revenue. They're going to do corporations, all this stuff. But we care about a platform that's a little bigger than that and a little further outside of that. The real value is gaming. Esports has value. And we understand the esports business, right? They're operating teams. They sell tickets, they create content, they do corporate partnerships, and they try to win games and trophies. We get that. We fundamentally get that. It's delivered on a different medium, but we fundamentally get that. And then the gaming piece is where we saw the real opportunity for growth. So, Misfits has been ultra bullish on that. And it's also, we've got a JV for esports related apparel. So how do we touch these other segments, not just esports teams? And that was one of the interesting things for us in Misfits. And we've also invested in a company called Status Pro, co-founded by a former Browns player, Andrew Hawkins, and his business partner, Troy Jones. That is a VR game solution that's going to have some big announcements coming up in the coming months. And there's another opportunity to invest into Black entrepreneurs that co-founded a business. But at its core, it's a good business that we believed in, and we believe in gaming. Fortunate that a number of us that really evaluate these deals have young kids. We got a demo of VR, and they check it out. It's like, whoa, this is really cool. You say, I may not get this, but that he does.
Yeah.
And you just look at all the metrics of games sold or people engaging with esports. The numbers and the metrics don't lie. Do I get it? No. I didn't grow up like that. But then when I take a step back and say, well, when I was in high school, I used to sit in friends' basements and we'd watch 2 people who played Madden against each other. We'd wait until it was our turn. It has the same thing happening. It's just that everyone is playing at the same time and feels more engaged than ever. It really isn't that new. It's just delivered differently.
No, that's it's interesting to watch, and I agree with you. We all want to root for something. We all want to identify, wear a jersey, and that's valuable. So, as much as I'd like to keep you all day, I know you've got work to do, but I've got a few exit questions for you. You're incredibly impressive, and I suspect there might be a book or speech or something that has inspired you that you think about. Is there that 1 or 2 touchstones that you would recommend to folks?
I'll actually, it's tough to be put on the spot with books. I'm a bit of a bibliophile. I actually just read a book, a friend of mine, Scott Crace, works for Bolt Ventures, which is David Blitzer's family office. During the holidays this past year, he gave out a number of copies of John Dornbach's book, Life is Magic. former long snapper for the Eagles. And I just finished reading it a few weeks ago. And it talks about his life and how he found something to gravitate towards. His father killed his mother when he was 12 years old. He had to work really hard to be a long snapper in the NFL, and he still struggled. And then he ultimately had open heart surgery later in his life. I mean, he's in his late 30s right now. And he's been really, really tested, but he's found this thing that is quite literally magic to ground himself. And he found that thing that matters. It helps him be a good family man. It helps him be a good person. It helps him engage with the community. You've got this person who was maybe 12, 13 years, 14 years in the NFL. And he looks to magic as strong. Most athletes don't do that. Most people don't do that. So it's finding this thing that gives you meaning. And it's different for everyone. So I'm not willing to say that is number one book I'd hand to anyone.
Yeah.
I just finished it. Was given to me by a friend, and I thought it was fantastic.
That's great. No, yeah, it's hard to pick just one, isn't it?
If I am going to pick just one, though, the book that I read at least once a year, Kurt Vonnegut, Cat's Cradle, could read it over and over and over again.
I love it. That's a great one. Less business school and more
less business school.
For literature. It's brilliant.
I am listening to Michael Lewis did just do the first audiobook for Liar's Poker. It's never existed before. Someone had the rights to it. I've never done anything with it. So he just put that out, and then he's got a simultaneous podcast where he kind of reflects on what was going on. And it's funny, he talks to what that book actually did. He wrote it with the intention of scaring people away from Wall Street, but instead it made people like me say, whoa, I want to do that, which is incredibly ironic. And he reflects back on that. And I semi-distinctively remember in college when I decided that I'd like to, maybe work in finance, reading that book. And that put me over the edge of I really, really want to do it. So it's kind of funny, 16 years later, listening to Michael Lewis, who I think the world of, reflect on that book and what he was thinking at the time and sort of what he thinks about his writing and that specific story today. So I'm listening to that on audiobook just because I like to listen to Michael Lewis. I can listen to him all day.
Me too. I will check that out. I remember my brother moved to Berkeley a little over a decade ago, and apparently Michael Lewis is his neighbor, and I'm always telling him, can't we just go by his house? I think he wants to meet me. He just doesn't realize.
Michael Lewis is on my list of, you take three people, go, who's your fourth? So Michael Lewis is in it.
Yeah. No, he'd be fascinating. Okay, last question is, some of the younger professionals who are embarking on their career like you did, that advice to them, from being somebody who manages professionals, who uses outside professionals, what is that secret sauce you look for when you're interacting with professionals?
I was fortunate when I was at Goldman. I had a number of lawyers, two in particular come to mind. Admittedly, they weren't at K&L Gates, but a woman named Randy Bernstein and Jason Goldstein at DLA Piper, and they represented us on a lot of sports things, and they were really smart and in the client service business, right? But they were the people that I could call when I didn't know the answer, and they would give me the answer. And they didn't judge me for not knowing the answer. They didn't make me feel dumb for not knowing the answer. And after several years, they knew what I knew and didn't know. And so they knew how to guide me. They knew when I saw a term sheet, how I was going to react to stuff. And they knew what I was thinking before I thought it. And they never judged me. They were responsive. They were respectful. And they're, two of my closest professional friends, two of my closest personal friends. And without those two giving me the comfort that I could leverage them as a resource and I could trust them to help make me better, I don't think I have some of the same success that I'd otherwise had. So you have to find those people. And they exist, period. They exist. Regardless of what you do or what you're doing, there are those people. It doesn't necessarily have to be the banker leveraging the lawyers. There's always somebody that can be a resource to you to help you be better, who's not going to judge you, who you can put absolute trust in. And if you respect each other and you both serve as a resource where and when you can, and when your skills and your expertise help the others, you can grow together. So you have to find that. You have to find not just mentors that are senior to you, but peers that know something you don't, that can go along the journey with you. And that being said, I hope that there are people that say the same thing about me. There are people that, to me, the greatest achievement is having people who used to work for me who are now more successful than me. Like, great, love it. And it's funny when the tables start to turn, and as you get older, they probably once looked to me for guidance. Now I call them and say, hey, I need the answers to this. And, careers last a long time. I feel like my career has been forever. It's been 15 years. I'm 36 years old. I've got a long way ahead of me. And there are going to be more people who at one point in time worked for me, in quotes, my colleagues on an org chart at some point in time that are going to be more senior than me, that were smarter than me then. They were just behind me on an org chart, and careers are the long game. So find people you can trust, find people that you like working with, and go on a journey with them.
Yeah, that is so important. And I mean, the concept that you felt heard, you felt comfortable, you felt that they were owning an issue and being straight with you. And, we're all just trying to grow. I learned from lawyers at other firms. I learned from clients. I learned from people that aren't my clients or lawyers at my firm. It's just, you've just got to be around and being willing to accept it and listen and slow down a little bit. And I think it's great advice. You're incredibly impressive. Your humility, your excellence, kind of the way you approach problems, the way you kind of describe things, it's really been a joy to do this podcast, Josh. I hope it's the first of more of our conversations. And with all due respect to your Packers, I hope that
I'm a Browns fan. I could care less about the Packers.
No, I hear you. I know you're a Browns fan. You made that very clear, but I just hope that maybe in 2023, you and I can just sneak away for a quick beer before the Cowboys play the Browns in the Super Bowl. So,
amen. Well, yeah. I really appreciate you having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Likewise. Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.